What the heck is green GDP? Well, if you take a look at it, GDP is gross domestic product. And if you look at green GDP, it's a measure of a country's economic growth that takes into account all of the bad stuff, the negative impact that economic activities can have on the environment. This is different from like traditional measures of economic growth that only look at the production of goods of services. Now, green GDP takes into account stuff like the cost of pollution and the depletion of natural resources, like trees, forests. And it means that you get a more accurate picture of a country's economic performance. And that helps to ensure that economic growth is sustainable for everybody in the long term, like 100 years in the future. Now, let's talk about how we subsidize pollution today. You might be wondering, like, what the heck does that mean? Well, it basically means that we're giving something a financial boost without actually charging for it. And when it comes to pollution, you can end up with some pretty big problems. You see, a lot of the time, the true cost of our pollution isn't reflected in the prices of goods and services. This means that companies can pollute without having to pay for the damage that they're causing. Now, the cost of this pollution is passed on to everybody, society as a whole, worldwide. That can have serious consequences for the environment, for human health. So, how is green GDP different from all this stuff? Well, green GDP takes into account the true cost of our pollution. It means that activities that cause environmental damage aren't rewarded with higher GDP like they are right now. Instead, green GDP goes out and rewards activities that are sustainable and don't have negative environmental impacts. This is going to encourage businesses and individuals to kind of find practices that are more environmentally friendly and help to ensure that economic growth is sustainable in the long term, 10 years in the future, 100 years in the future. Another way that green GDP is different because it takes into account the depletion of natural resources. Under the current way of doing things, the depletion of natural resources isn't accounted for in the measurement of economic growth. This means that activities like mining and logging can be profitable even though they have long-term bad effects on the environment. Some logging for building a house is fine, but if you're cutting down the Amazon rainforest, it's a problem. Now, green GDP, on the other hand, takes into account the depletion of natural resources, which means that these activities aren't rewarded with a higher GDP. This encourages businesses and individuals to have practices that are more sustainable and don't deplete natural resources. So, green GDP. It's a way of measuring economic growth that takes into account the negative impact that economic activities have on our environment. It's different from the way that we subsidize pollution today by not pricing it, because we don't account for the true cost of the pollution and the depletion of natural resources. If we can all use green GDP, we can encourage more sustainable practices and help ensure economic growth is sustainable in the long run. Why don't we do it? Well, if countries were to switch to green GDP, you have to subtract all the damage that we're doing to the environment from growth. And our economic growth for a country might go negative. So today, we use a simpler form, GDP, gross domestic product, and we don't account for a lot of the bad stuff. So every year it looks like our GDP is increasing. It looks like we're making more and more stuff, making more and more wealth. But until you add in those negative externalities, the damage that we do, those numbers could actually be negative. We're becoming less wealthy in the future. What do you think?